When you think of human flight, you think of jets streaking through the sky, rockets punching the stratosphere, astronauts floating in the endless dark. But before all that, there were two quiet brothers in a bicycle shop, tinkering with wood and cloth and gears, watching birds, testing wings in the bitter wind of the Outer Banks. They didn't have wealth, they didn't have formal training. They had stubbornness and a dream that mocked gravity. Tonight, on Faces of History, we meet the Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville, the men who taught humanity to fly, one handmade propeller at a time. I'm the Duke of New York. Strap in, we're going back to Kitty Hawk, back to the gusts and gulls, back to the moment the earth let go of two men who refused to stay grounded. Before there were wings, there was wonder. Before the flyer rose from the dunes at Kitty Hawk, there was a house on Hawthorne Street in Dayton, Ohio, filled with questions. Wilbur Wright was born in 1867, the third son of Milton and Susan Wright. 4 years later, Orville arrived, tiny, restless, crying out for adventure the moment his lungs tasted air. The world they opened their eyes to wasn't yet speeding on rails or buzzing with engines. America was still horse-drawn, still steam and sweat. The tallest thing in most towns was the church steeple. Their father, Bishop Milton Wright, was no ordinary small-town preacher. He was stern, a man of deep faith and fierce convictions. He fought church schisms, printed pamphlets, and when necessary, threw words sharper than any blade. He didn't give his sons riches, but he gave them books, a lifetime supply. He filled their house with newspapers, pamphlets, sermons, science tracts. The Wright children devoured it all. Their dinner table conversations might drift from Greek philosophers to the machinery of printing presses, from biblical stories to the physics of wind and birds. Their mother, Susan Catherine Corner Wright, was the quiet genius behind the scenes. Her father had been a skilled carriage maker, and Susan inherited his hands. Where other mothers taught needlework, she taught her boys how to shape metal, how to balance a tool, how to fix what was broken. The Wright boys grew up in her shadow at the workbench, watching her build toys and repair broken household gadgets when neighbors came knocking. Wilbur was the thinker. Tall, thin, intense. He read thick books late into the night. History, philosophy, engineering manuals borrowed from anyone who would lend them. He was serious in a way that made other boys uncomfortable, except Orville. Orville was the spark to Wilbur's flint, quick to joke, quick to tinker, never satisfied until he'd pulled apart some new toy just to see how it ticked. The Wrights didn't have money for fancy tutors. What they did have was freedom. The boys built kites from newspaper and scrap wood. They rigged sleds and improvised skates for Ohio's icy winters. If something broke, they fixed it. If it didn't exist, they made it. Then came the toy that changed everything. A small helicopter their father brought back from a trip. Simple, 2 blades spun by a twisted rubber band, inspired by a French design. It zipped up, hovered for a breathless moment, and spun to the floor. For most children, it was a fleeting thrill. For Wilbur and Orville, it was an obsession. They built copies. They made them bigger. They asked why the toy lifted, why it spun, why it fell. Long before they ever saw an airfield, the seed was planted. If a toy could fly, why not a man? Life tested the Wrights early. In 1885, Wilbur's trajectory toward college changed overnight. A hockey stick to the face, a brutal accident in a pickup game. His front teeth knocked out. The wound festered, the pain constant. Wilbur withdrew from the world. Instead of Yale, he stayed home. He nursed his mother who had fallen ill with tuberculosis. He read everything he could find. He wrote letters to learned men, sharpening the mind that would later calculate lift and drag better than any professor's chalkboard could. Orville, meanwhile, was restless as ever. He dropped out of high school before his final year. But he wasn't idle. He built his own printing press at age 15, cobbled from spare wood, a tombstone slab, and pure nerve. He printed a school newspaper, then a neighborhood one. Then he dragged Wilbur into the business. The Wright brothers learned deadlines, distribution, typesetting, lessons in precision and problem solving that would serve them well when they traded ink and lead for spruce and canvas. By the 1890s, America's towns were suddenly humming with a new invention, the bicycle. Freedom on 2 wheels, no horse to feed, no train schedule to follow, just you, the road, and the balance of gears and pedals. The Wrights saw not just a ride, but a revolution. They opened the Wright Cycle Exchange in Dayton. They sold bikes, built custom frames, repaired them when rough roads snapped a spoke or bent a rim. Bicycles taught the brothers about balance, a lesson few others grasped when it came to flight. A bicycle stays upright because it's moving. Tip it too far and you fall. Control comes from constant tiny adjustments, the same principle a bird uses when it banks and turns in the wind. Each new customer, each clink of the cash register, funded their curiosity. Spare parts, new tools, stacks of books on aerodynamics and bird wings. While the world's greatest engineers laughed at the dream of powered flight, the Wrights quietly studied wind pressure, the shape of feathers, and the way a seagull tilts its wingtips into a gust. In 1896, a name hit the headlines that would shove Wilbur and Orville's curiosity into overdrive. Otto Lilienthal, the glider king of Germany, had died when his glider stalled and crashed from a hill. Lilienthal's gliders proved heavier than air flight was possible, but also deadly. To others, his death was a warning. To the Wrights, it was an invitation. Wilbur wrote to the Smithsonian for every scrap of Lilienthal's work. He read everything about failed airships, balloon flights, and experiments from Europe's pioneers. Two boys who once flew a toy helicopter in a parlor now plotted how to lift a man from the earth. They weren't pilots yet, just bicycle mechanics in a Midwest shop that smelled of chain oil and sawdust, but they were ready to test gravity itself. Two brethren questioned, could man fly? The world laughed. The Wrights didn't. They were children of curiosity, about to grow wings. If you walked into Dayton, Ohio in the late 19th century, you wouldn't see Wilbur and Orville Wright wearing lab coats or poring over blueprints in marble halls. You'd see two young men in rolled-up sleeves, grease under their fingernails, bouncing between bicycles and printing presses in a shop that smelled of oil, ink, and ambition. Long before they ever set foot in the wind at Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers mastered a different kind of flight, the flight of ideas. Messy, restless, constantly circling new problems to solve. Wilbur and Orville's first venture wasn't into the air, it was into words. Orville, the younger, was just 15 when he built his own printing press. He scavenged old wood, bits of scrap metal, even parts from a tombstone. No one taught him how. He figured it out with a dogged stubbornness that would one day defy gravity itself. He launched a school paper first, The Midget, and then roped Wilbur into co-founding the West Side News, a neighborhood weekly. Together, they printed local gossip, advertisements, and editorials. They wrote, edited, typeset, ran the press, and hawked subscriptions door to door. They learned something crucial here, the discipline to stick with a problem. Every crooked line of type was a lesson in precision, every jammed press a puzzle to untangle. They learned to fix what broke, because no one else was going to fix it for them. When the West Side News fizzled, they launched the Evening Item. It fizzled too, but they didn't. Failure wasn't a graveyard for the Wrights, it was fuel. Each misstep taught them more about machines, about stubbornness, about the fine line between chaos and mastery. In the 1890s, America caught a fever, the bicycle craze. Roads were rough, horses were expensive, trains went only where the rails led. But a bicycle? That was freedom you could steer with your own two hands. Orville and Wilbur saw more than shiny new toys. They saw an engineering puzzle begging to be perfected. In 1892, they opened the Wright Cycle Exchange, a humble storefront where they sold and repaired bicycles for Dayton's growing legion of riders. They didn't just fix chains and patch tires. They designed their own bikes, the Van Cleve and the St. Clair. They tested new gear systems, crafted stronger frames, tweaked bearings to roll smoother and faster. And here's the genius hidden in the grease and spoke wrenches. The bicycle was their quiet classroom for the physics of flight. A bicycle doesn't balance itself. It stays upright because you steer it, constantly making tiny corrections that the rider barely notices, the same delicate dance that would one day keep an airplane stable in shifting winds. Balance, control, forward momentum. The Wrights learned more about these principles on a bicycle seat than many engineers did at a university desk. Troublemakers in a city of doubters. Dayton wasn't Paris or London. There were no grand salons of inventors or fancy laboratories lined with brass and glass. It was a city of factories, foundries, rail yards, a place where new machines roared and old ideas rusted. In this blue-collar town, the Wright brothers were known as eccentric, maybe even a little suspicious. Neighbors sometimes peeked into their shop windows and gossiped. What are they building now? Why do they keep staring at birds? Local reporters mocked them as those two cranks with a death wish. But the brothers didn't care. In the back of the shop, after the day's customers rolled away on newly polished bikes, they'd drag out notebooks and scraps of wood and begin their real work, testing tiny wings, sketching glider frames, building experimental kites. They read everything they could find: the flawed lift tables of Samuel Langley, the glider experiments of Otto Lilienthal, the early failures of Sir George Cayley. Where others saw dead ends, Wilbur and Orville saw places to begin again, to measure more precisely, to build smarter. By the late 1890s, their bicycle shop was dug as the world's tiniest aeronautical laboratory. They built a wind tunnel, a wooden box, a fan driven by a simple engine, and rows of meticulously carved miniature wings they tested by hand. They measured lift and drag with homemade balances. They charted airflow over curved surfaces. What they discovered shocked them. Much of the so-called expert data was flat out wrong. Lift coefficients were off. Drag estimates were nonsense. The Wrights weren't just tinkerers anymore. They were quietly becoming the world's leading authorities on how air behaves when it kisses a wing. In a world where engineers argued that flight would require massive engines strapped to massive frames, the Wrights saw a different truth. Flight wasn't about brute force. It was about balance, control, and subtlety. The same subtlety you learn when you ride a bike without falling. But the Wrights' workshop was mostly full of frustration: snapped spars, warped ribs, calculations that wouldn't add up. They built, broke, rebuilt. Wilbur's calm patience and Orville's restless tinkering made them fight too. They bickered over wing shapes. They argued about control surfaces. But when they clashed, sparks flew in the right direction, toward solutions. And when they got stuck, they leaned on each other. There was no university professor to consult, no airplane industry to call for parts. There was only them, two self-made engineers, using bicycle profits to pay for spruce wood canvas and a dream. In Dayton's dusty back rooms, Wilbur and Orville Wright taught themselves to see the invisible, the way air lifted, twisted, pushed back. They were not professors or pilots. They were tinkerers and troublemakers, the kind history underestimates until they change everything. By the end of the 19th century, the Wright brothers were ready to trade the cramped shadows of their Dayton workshop for something bigger: the open sky. They knew their math. They trusted their wind tunnel results. But theories meant nothing until they felt the wind tear at their ribs and canvas, until they saw if their delicate dream could ride the same invisible currents that held up a bird. They needed three things: steady wind, soft sand to cushion the crashes they knew were coming, and isolation, far from reporters, doubters, and well-meaning experts who do nothing but talk them down. They found all three on a lonely stretch of the Outer Banks, a narrow slip of barrier islands off North Carolina, dotted with fishing villages and shifting dunes, a place called Kitty Hawk. In 1900, Wilbur wrote to Octave Chanute, a respected engineer and glider pioneer, asking for advice on the perfect testing ground. Chanute pointed them toward North Carolina's coastal winds. Wilbur wrote a letter to Joseph Dosher, the government's local weather station man at Kitty Hawk. Dosher replied in plain Carolina dialect: "The wind blew steady here, fierce enough to lift a kite, or maybe a man." The Wrights packed crates of pine spars, canvas sheets, bicycle chains, and their notebooks filled with equations scribbled by oil lamp. They boarded trains, rode steamboats, and trudged down dirt roads until they stood ankle-deep in the gritty sand. Kitty Hawk wasn't paradise. It was remote, primitive, battered by Atlantic storms. Mosquitoes rose in black clouds. Supplies came in by boat. The wind could cut you raw one minute and vanish the next. But the brothers saw only opportunity: soft dunes for soft landings, steady wind to keep them aloft, and no crowds to laugh when their strange contraption flopped nose first into the sand. The Wrights didn't leap straight into engines and propellers. They began with gliders, simple, fragile wings they could steer with their bodies. They built a camp of crude tents and a hangar cobbled together from driftwood and scrap lumber. They cooked tinned food on campfires, washed with buckets of salt water, wrote daily letters home that read like shipwreck diaries. Their first glider in 1900 was a big kite, 17 feet of wingspan, just enough lift to carry Wilbur's wiry frame when the wind was right. He lay belly down, gripping a crude cradle that let him warp the wings to bank left or right. They learned quickly. The lift was disappointing. The wind didn't always do what they hoped. The control surfaces needed constant tweaking. When the glider lurched sideways or dipped its nose, Wilbur's entire body became part of the machine, shifting his hips, pulling cords, wrestling the air. In Dayton, they'd spent hours observing birds, hawks and gulls that bent their wingtips in subtle midair corrections. The Wrights mimicked this with a radical idea: wing warping. Instead of a rigid wing, the outer edges would twist, banking the craft smoothly. It was simple, elegant, and unlike anything their competitors were trying. 1901, failure and a fresh wind. The next year, they returned with a bigger glider, longer wings, improved bracing. It flew, but not as well as they'd hoped. The lift still fell short of the numbers they'd painstakingly calculated back in Dayton. They endured gusts that flipped the glider end over end, dunes that scraped skin raw, and mosquito swarms that left them swatting themselves bloody in the night. Many would have quit. Wilbur nearly did. He wrote to Chanute that man's dream of flight might truly be impossible. But that's the thing about the Wright brothers. Disappointment didn't end the story, it sharpened it. Back in Dayton that winter, they built a homemade wind tunnel. They carved hundreds of miniature wings, tested them under controlled gusts, and discovered what the textbooks had missed. The accepted data on lift and drag was wrong. Their rivals, using flawed figures, were building machines doomed to fail before they left the ground. The Wrights replaced guesses with hard numbers. When they returned to Kitty Hawk in 1902, they brought the world's first truly functional glider, a biplane with a horizontal tail for pitch control, vertical rudders for yaw, and that now famous wing warping trick for roll. They didn't just glide, they soared. Hundreds of flights, each one longer, smoother, more controlled. They cracked the puzzle that had baffled geniuses for centuries: how to balance an unstable machine in an unstable medium, the air. By late 1903, the Wrights knew they were ready for power. They designed and built a custom gasoline engine with the help of their mechanic, Charlie Taylor. It delivered 12 horsepower, just enough to push their craft forward at the speed needed for lift. They carved twin propellers by hand, realizing that a propeller wasn't just a fan, but a rotating wing that had to fly in a circle, slicing the air efficiently. December 17th, 1903. Bitter cold. The dunes crusted with frost. Wilbur and Orville flipped a coin. Orville won. He lay belly down in the flyer, its spruce ribs rattling against the rail. Wilbur steadied the wingtip. The engine coughed, spat, then roared. The flyer clattered forward, lifted off the rail, and left the earth for 12 seconds and 120 feet. It was awkward, low, barely more than a leap, but it was powered, controlled, heavier than air flight. 3 more flights that day. Wilbur's longest, 852 feet and 59 seconds. Then the wind caught the flyer and flipped it into ruin, but it didn't matter. History had shifted in a breath. No brass bands played. No crowds cheered. The world's first flight was witnessed by 5 locals, a few telegraph operators, and a cold Atlantic wind. But on that lonely dune, the Wright brothers, Wilbur the methodical and Orville the tinkerer, cracked the code that had grounded humanity for millennia. They didn't just glide on air. They harnessed it, steered it, and proved that gravity could be mocked by science, grit, and a little bit of bicycle grease. Kitty Hawk wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. 2 brothers, 1 fragile craft. 1 bitter wind on a lonely sand dune, and a moment when the earth, just for 12 seconds, let them go. December 17, 1903, a date so small on the calendar, yet large enough to carry the weight of all the centuries that came before it. The Wright brothers woke before dawn in their drafty camp at Kill Devil Hills, a lonely stretch of sand 4 miles south of Kitty Hawk proper. The chill in the air was sharp enough to bite through wool coats and numb fingers to the bone. The dunes were crusted with frost, the Atlantic wind already howling, the very wind that would be both enemy and ally that day. Their machine, the flyer, lay waiting in its shed. 605 pounds of spruce, muslin, and dreams. 40 feet of wingspan, no cockpit, just a cradle for the pilot to lie flat, face first, into history. Wilbur and Orville had rebuilt parts of the flyer again and again. Windstorms had blown it off its launching rail more than once. Salt air corroded metal. Sand invaded every gear and seam. Every nail, every rib of spruce had to be checked by hand. They designed their own engine from scratch. An aluminum block, 12 horsepower, barely strong enough to pull the flyer and pilot forward against the drag of wind and friction, but strong enough, they hoped, to lift them off the earth. Their propellers, hand-carved in Dayton, spun behind the pilot like twin wooden scythes slicing invisible paths through the air. Unlike other experimenters who saw propellers as nothing more than windmills, the Wrights understood them for what they really were: rotating wings, lifting the flyer forward the same way the fixed wings lifted it up. They dragged the flyer out onto the makeshift launch rail, 60 feet of plank laid on the hard-packed sand. The rail would guide the flyer straight and true until the air beneath its wings could take over. Wilbur and Orville flipped a coin for the honor of the first try. Wilbur won the toss and lost the flight. His first attempt, 3 days earlier, ended in a nosedive after just a few feet when the flyer lurched off the rail too steeply and slammed into the sand, breaking a strut. They patched it up in the freezing nights that followed, breath visible in lantern light as they worked. So now it was Orville's turn. 5 locals had wandered over to watch the spectacle: John Daniels, Adam Etheridge, Will Doe, W.C. Brinkley, and Johnny Moore, surfmen and lifeguards from the nearby life-saving station. Tough men used to storms and shipwrecks, but not used to seeing a man try to outfly a gull. Wilbur steadied the right wingtip. Orville lay flat on the lower wing, hands gripping the cradle controls, eyes squinting against the biting wind. They had no seatbelt, no windshield, no real guarantee the flyer wouldn't flip, stall, or disintegrate midair. They had calculations and faith. That was it. Orville released the restraining wire. The propellers bit into the cold morning air. The flyer rattled and shuddered down the rail. At the end of the track, there was nothing, just open sand, cold wind, and gravity waiting to yank them back. But at the end of that rail, the flyer did what no heavier-than-air machine had done before. It lifted, wobbled, climbed a few feet above the sand. The engine sputtered and strained. The canvas wings flexed and moaned. For 12 seconds, the earth let go. Orville flew 120 feet before the nose dipped gently and the flyer slid to a halt in the sand. He turned to Wilbur, a grin frozen on his wind-burned face. They'd done it. No ropes, no tricks, no lighter-than-air balloon carrying the weight, just man, machine, and the wind beneath a wing. They weren't done. The Wrights dragged the flyer back to the rail again. Wilbur flew next, 175 feet. Orville climbed back in, 200 feet. Each flight a little longer, a little smoother, the brothers switching places like kids on a new bicycle. At 12 noon, Wilbur took the final flight of the day. He rode the flyer for 852 feet, almost a full minute in the air, carving a low arc just above the sand while the surfmen stared slack-jawed, waves pounding behind them. When the flyer landed, it did so hard, a sudden gust flipping it end over end, smashing struts and tearing canvas. By the time they checked the damage, the flyer was beyond repair for that season. But it didn't matter. The real damage was to the old idea that man was forever earthbound. In 4 brief hops, the Wright brothers rewrote the boundaries of the possible. Success 4 flights Thursday morning, all against 21-mile wind, started from level with engine power alone. Average speed through air, 31 miles, longest 57 seconds, inform press home Christmas. The world barely noticed. A few newspapers ran the story, buried among farm reports and weather notes. Some called it a hoax. Others ignored it entirely. The New York Times gave more space to an inventor who claimed he'd build a flying car powered by flapping wings. But the Wrights didn't care. They packed up the broken flyer, their wind-burned faces cracked with salt and cold, and took the train home for Christmas. In their minds, in their notebooks, in the scraps of canvas stained with oil and sea salt, they carried a secret the world didn't yet understand. Man could fly. 12 seconds, 120 feet. Hardly a stone's throw by today's standards. But from that fragile liftoff on the dunes came the age of flight. Barnstormers roaring across hayfields, fighter planes over France, transatlantic crossings, airliners stitching continents together, astronauts pushing beyond the sky itself. All of it, every supersonic engine, every contrail, every seatbelt click on takeoff, traces back to a splintery rail on a cold Carolina morning. When you lift off the runway, when your stomach flips at that sudden rush skyward, that's the ghost of the flyer beneath your wings. That's Orville, belly down in the cold. That's Wilbur, steadying the wingtip, holding up his brother and holding up all of us. December 17, 1903, should have been enough. They had done it, defied gravity, lifted man off the earth with a powered, controlled machine. But here's the brutal truth. The first flight didn't crown them heroes overnight. No brass band met them at the Dayton station. No newspaper plastered their faces on every front page. The world, for the most part, shrugged. And so began the Wright brothers' next great test. Not just building the plane, but convincing a skeptical world that it could really fly and that they had done it first. Most so-called experts wrote them off. The New York Times doubted powered flight could be achieved for another 50 years. Scientists scoffed. Two bicycle mechanics from Ohio? Who did they think they were? Meanwhile, other aeronautical geniuses, well-funded, well-published, staged public trials that ended in splintered wreckage. Samuel Langley, secretary of the Smithsonian, had tried just days before the Wrights flew. His massive aerodrome catapulted off a houseboat and plunged straight into the Potomac River, twice, a humiliating, soggy fiasco. Yet when Langley failed, the newspapers politely covered it as a noble experiment. When the Wrights succeeded, alone on a windy dune with no crowd, the news barely got out. They were forced to play a dangerous game, keep flying in secret to perfect their machine, but guard their hard-earned secrets from rivals who would steal or dismiss them. The brothers hauled the battered Flyer home and went back to work. In 1904, they built the Flyer 2, a sturdier, more powerful version. They found a new testing field in a cow pasture at Huffman Prairie, just outside Dayton. Flat, wide, hidden from prying eyes. But Huffman Prairie was no forgiving dune. The wind didn't help them anymore. They had to launch under their own power, every time. Early flights ended nose first in muddy furrows, the propellers snapping, the skids splintering. Wilbur and Orville often spent more time fixing than flying, but each crash taught them. They added a catapult launch system, a falling weight that pulled the Flyer forward fast enough to lift it when the wind failed. They refined the controls, rudders, elevators, wing warping, learning to bank and turn in the air. They didn't just fly in a straight line anymore. They flew circles, figure eights, laps around the pasture that left cows blinking in confusion. By the end of 1904, they had strung together flights lasting 5 minutes, then 10. Controlled, repeatable, undeniable. They wanted proof. Here it is. Still, the world demanded proof. So in 1905, the Wrights unveiled the Flyer 3. Stronger, faster, fully controllable. On October 5th, Wilbur climbed into the Flyer 3 and flew for 39 minutes and 24 miles, circling Huffman Prairie 30 times without landing, a distance that would have taken a horse and carriage hours to cross. He only landed because he ran out of fuel. There was no more doubt. Anyone standing at the edge of that field saw it with their own eyes. Man could fly, and not just in a straight leap of luck. He could take off, turn, circle, land at will. But still, no ticker tape parade, no contract, no recognition from the U.S. government. The brothers wrote letters, showed photos, invited dignitaries to watch. Few came. Those who did still didn't grasp what they were seeing or didn't want to believe it. The Wrights knew they needed protection and money to keep building. They filed for a patent, not for the plane itself, but for its revolutionary control system. The subtle warping of the wings and the movable rudders that made powered flights stable and steerable. Rivals dismissed them as secretive and petty. But Wilbur and Orville had watched too many inventors have their ideas stolen. If they didn't guard their secret, others would bolt wings to engines and claim the skies as their own. So they flew in secret. They tested when no one was looking. They refused to sign contracts until buyers, foreign or domestic, agreed to demonstrations and royalties. Some thought they were bluffing until they took their secret overseas. By 1908, the Wrights took their flying circus to Europe, where aviation fever burned hot. Wilbur crossed the Atlantic first, arriving in France with crates of the Flyer and a healthy dose of Midwestern grit. At Le Mans, he reassembled the plane and took to the air before a skeptical crowd of journalists, engineers, and aristocrats. He banked gracefully over fields and rooftops, dipping the wings, turning on a dime. Everything the European experimenters had claimed was impossible. Overnight, Wilbur became a sensation. Crowds cheered him as he soared over the French countryside. He gave royalty rides. He signed deals with governments eager to unlock the military potential of powered flight. Meanwhile, Orville stunned crowds back home, giving demonstration flights at Fort Myer, Virginia, for the U.S. Army. His graceful turns and figure eights converted doubters into believers. But it came at a cost. In September 1908, Orville's flyer crashed due to a propeller failure, seriously injuring him and killing his passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, the first fatality in powered flight. Orville barely survived, his hip and back shattered. But the demonstration had proved the principle and sealed the Army contract they needed. By 1909, the Wright brothers had done it. They'd flown publicly, had sold their flyer to the U.S. Army Signal Corps for $30,000, the world's first military airplane. They'd licensed deals in France and Germany. They'd transformed from eccentric bicycle mechanics into aviation pioneers, owners of patents that forced every future aviator to tip a hat and pay a royalty. When Wilbur flew demonstration loops in France, little boys watched in wonder. One day they'd become the barnstormers of the Roaring Twenties, the pilots who crossed oceans and continents. When Orville lifted off at Fort Myer, young Army officers took notes that would lead to fighter squadrons, airmail, and global air travel. The Wright brothers didn't just prove they could fly. They forced the whole world to admit it, believe it, and chase it. From Kitty Hawk's lonely dunes to European airfields roaring with crowds, they did more than launch a machine. They launched an era. Two stubborn bicycle mechanics from Dayton proved it to the world, and we never touched the ground the same way again. When Orville and Wilbur Wright packed up the battered flyer and boarded a train back to Dayton that Christmas of 1903, they carried more than canvas scraps and broken spars. They carried the seed of an idea that would grow larger and wilder than either of them could imagine. What they had done at Kitty Hawk was simple and impossible all at once. They made the earth negotiable. They turned distance, the old tyrant of kingdoms and continents, into a challenge to be laughed at. The day they lifted off that rail was the day we stopped being creatures of the ground. But the Wright brothers' story didn't end with that first hop, nor even with the crowds in France or the Army contracts back home. Their greatest test and their greatest tragedy would be the fight to protect what they had built and the race they ignited. By the early 1910s, the Wrights were world famous. They toured Europe. They trained new pilots. They built the Wright Company, America's first airplane factory. Orders came in from militaries and governments hungry to unlock the power of flight. What began in a bicycle shop was now an industry. Hangars sprouting from muddy fields, pilots daring gravity to do its worst, crowds gasping as daredevils looped and dived through county fair air shows. But with success came predators. Rivals and imitators popped up overnight. Curtiss, Blériot, Farman. Bold flyers and clever engineers who took what the Wrights had proven possible and pushed it faster, farther, higher. Wilbur and Orville found themselves fighting a new battle. Not against the wind, but in courtrooms. Patent wars swallowed their energy and poisoned friendships. They sued Glenn Curtiss and others for using wing warping and control surfaces that violated their hard-earned patents. These battles dragged for years, overshadowing the magic of what they had done. Instead of inventing new planes, the Wrights spent precious time with lawyers and depositions. Their genius, that spark that rose off the dunes, got tangled in paperwork and bitterness. In 1912, the fight took a toll that even the wind couldn't. Wilbur, the elder brother, the calm mind, the steady hand on the wingtip, contracted typhoid fever after a business trip to Boston. He died at just 45. Orville was shattered, he said of Wilbur, a short life, full of consequences. Wilbur's death didn't just take away a brother, it took away the partnership that made their dream fly in the first place. Alone, Orville kept the company running for a time, but his heart was never in the boardroom. The thrill for him was always the workbench, the test flight, the feel of wind pressing against fabric wings. By 1915, Orville sold the Wright Company and stepped away. He became a quiet elder statesman of flight, advising, observing, a living reminder of how it all began. He kept tinkering in private, restoring old flyers, watching as the world raced far beyond anything he and Wilbur had dreamed in that Dayton bicycle shop. When Europe plunged into the First World War, airplanes, once flimsy toys for fairground daredevils, became weapons, scout planes, bombers, dogfights high over the trenches of France. The Wright brothers' principles of control, balance, lift, all taught at Huffman Prairie and Kitty Hawk, powered these new machines. Pilots looped and rolled, guns mounted to synchronize propellers, steel replacing canvas as altitude climbed. In just over a decade, the flyer's fragile wooden ribs evolved into squadrons of Sopwith camels, Fokkers, Spads, symbols of modern warfare. And after the war, the pilots came home hungry for peacetime speed. Barnstorming circuses, airmail routes crossing the country, stunt flights across oceans. The world had caught up with the Wrights and was now racing past them, skyward. Orville lived long enough to see the dream explode far beyond the dunes of Kill Devil Hills. He saw Charles Lindbergh cross the Atlantic solo in 1927. He saw commercial airliners stitching continents together. He saw test pilots shatter the sound barrier. He saw jets slice through the stratosphere at speeds that would have ripped the wings clean off the flyer. In 1944, the Smithsonian Institution, which once refused to credit the Wrights' achievement, finally admitted defeat and honored their flyer as the first true airplane. Orville stood beneath its fabric wings in Washington, D.C., watching as the world's eyes turned at last to what he and Wilbur had built. On January 30th, 1948, Orville Wright died after a second heart attack. He was 70 years old, just months before Chuck Yeager would punch through the sound barrier, breaking yet another sky the Wright brothers once thought unreachable. When Orville passed, an entire age of aviation bowed its head. The last living half of humanity's first flight had landed and left the rest of us to soar. When you board a plane today, when you glance through a window at 35,000 feet, when you see the contrails stitching the blue above your head, that's Wilbur and Orville Wright. When an astronaut floats beyond the atmosphere, when Voyager slips past Pluto's orbit, that too is their echo. The Wright brothers didn't just build an airplane, they built the launch pad for everything that came after. They were not trained scientists, they didn't have funding or prestige. They were tinkerers, mechanics, watchers of birds and spinners of bicycle wheels. Yet from two stubborn minds came a truth no wind could deny. Flight is possible, not by miracle, but by method, by experiment, by never giving up when the wind smacks you nose first into the sand. When you look up, remember them. The brothers who taught us we don't have to stay on the ground. The wind is ours to shape. The sky is ours to cross. The stars are ours to reach. When you see a contrail scratched across the blue, hear the roar of a jet overhead, or watch a rocket vanish into the dark, you're hearing the echo of Wilbur and Orville Wright. Men who looked at the birds, felt the wind in their hands, and refused to believe Earth should be our only home. If you learned something tonight, share this story. Subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends that Faces of History doesn't just teach, it soars. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, the next time you lift off the runway, whisper thanks to two brothers in a bicycle shop who once taught us all how to fly.